Tombs, temples, and palaces. Everywhere we go across the land, we'll find a plethora of buildings that seem to fall under these broad categories. Why do we have so many tombs and temples, and what do we consider palaces? Today we're going to take our first look at the wondrous Taj Mahal, an architectural achievement from hundreds of years in the past. We're also going to look at some other examples of the structures that fall in the broad categories of tombs, temples, and palaces.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
It would appear with the remnants of structures from previous civilizations that we would have to redesignate them in our current civilization, and today we're going to explore some of the most obvious examples. We begin with the U.S. President tombs, and we've looked at these before, starting with Grant's tomb in New York City. President Ulysses S. Grant, an individual who's credited with winning the United States Civil War by using relentless frontal attacks and showing some operational aptitude in some of the battles he won, such as Vicksburg. But his presidency was rife with controversy and corruption, at least that's what the official history tells us. But in more recent years, as with other presidents, they've reevaluated his reputation, and therefore it makes it an understanding as to why he would deserve such a fabulous tomb. And indeed, this is a very wondrous tomb that shows the architectural stylings of what we might think of as Roman Greco, or perhaps it even integrates other architectural stylings such as Second Renaissance or Second Empire or Roman Greco-Renaissance, or even my favorite, Gargamel Revival style. In any event, these U.S. presidential tombs are very impressive structures, and Ulysses S. Grant's tomb is the most well-known. And you can see that it has the same architectural stylings that we've come to expect in our great Capitol buildings that we've seen in many other explorations. It has the pointed top and the many columns that surround the cupola. Why exactly, though, do we have some U.S. presidents that warrant such wondrous tombs? And there's a slew of explanations that attempt to address these questions. Well, some presidents had more personal finances. Of course, again, according to the official history, Ulysses S. Grant was in financial doldrums after he was swindled. Yes, isn't that ironic? A presidency that was rife with corruption. The president himself was subsequently the victim of corruption and being swindled. And he had to write his book on his Civil War memoirs that restored his family fortune. But are we to believe that it restored the family fortune to an extent that such a stellar and incredible tomb, which we know that at best we would be challenged to reproduce today, if we could at all, depending on what your assessment of the capabilities of modern contractors may be, yet somehow in the 1800s they managed to erect this wondrous tomb for President Ulysses S. Grant. Now, it's not just looking at the history and comparing and contrasting it with the intricate architecture that makes these explorations intriguing. It's also the fact that we see the many different layers, if you will, of the history, or the official account that's allegedly depicted in these buildings. For example, you can see these wondrous arches and indentations that make up the baseline structure of Grant's tomb. And much like many other structures, we are constantly renovating it, whether it's Grant's tomb, Garfield's tomb, or McKinley's tomb. Indeed, they have the most impressive tombs. Nope, we did not build a very magnificent tomb for the greatest U.S. president of all time, or at least the second greatest, depending on whether you count Washington as being first, which we're supposed to. We also have a temporary vault that was used to store Ulysses S. Grant's remains after he passed away. So that book must have been very successful to restore his family fortune, although the mainstream tries to address this concern with presidents retiring and then being in a very poor state of economic affairs by providing them a pension, because what happened to Ulysses S. Grant was considered, quite frankly, terrible at the time. And there was never a U.S. president who could retire and live in the unfortunate reality of poverty. No, that's only for the people in the workhouses. When you look at Grant's tomb, and if you visit it in person, though, you'll be amazed at how impressive the materials are. And indeed, it's the same thing for William McKinley's tomb. And you might recall President McKinley was the president who was unfortunately assassinated during the World's Fair in Buffalo under very mysterious circumstances, and indeed the trial and sentencing of the assassin was, well, for the American justice system, a matter of tremendous rapidity. and certainly not something that we tend to see in alacrity with our judicial affairs in the 2000s. But whether you're looking at McKinley's tomb or Garfield's tomb or Grant's tomb, you'll see the intricate architecture, the reliefs, and the many different elements of architectural styling that we tend to see that seem to reflect buildings of the past. Indeed, when we explored Garfield's tomb, and thanks to the good people of Cleveland who apparently donated the funds for it, that's the story behind it, you'll notice that it looks rather aged even in its initial appearances. And this is no doubt something that we have reflected in different images. Now, you could explain this by saying, well, the images were in black and white. Sometimes things just look older because they're in black and white. But when you study the details very carefully, there's no doubt that this original ornamentation and this color palette no doubt existed in the 1800s. Or maybe you just go with what Calvin's dad said in Calvin and Hobbes and just go with the recommendation that perhaps the entire world was in black and white until the 1930s, and then it turned to a color that was a little grainy. Let's go to France to look at Les Invalides, built 1671 to 1706. And French speakers, please correct my pronunciation on that. Sometimes I'm okay with French, sometimes I struggle. Christopher Lambert always shows up to laugh at me. But this is another one of these impressive complexes that we're informed was built to be what we would call a soldier's home that we explored extensively in the United States. Yes, during this time frame, 1671 to 1706, the French monarchy was concerned with the care of French soldiers. And you'll even find paintings of Napoleon visiting his injured soldiers in this very immense and amazing complex. Now, there's a variety of explanations for why they built such an ornate and elaborate complex or series of structures to care for their soldiers. And of course, you can compare and contrast this with the accounts that we have of the soldiers' homes that were built in the United States, both for the Union and Confederate veterans of the Civil War. And of course, compare that with the modern veterans' homes that we have. It's a little sad in some ways. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about this very complex structure, and looking at it in the overhead aerial, you can see the fine geometric precision with the layout of the complex and the central dome, and even the way that all the roads and the walkways seem to integrate and have a fine nexus point to them, or perhaps even a series of nexus points, depending on how you want to define it. This is where the remains of Napoleon Bonaparte, and indeed several members of his family and descendants, are buried. So it went from being a soldier's home, or the French version of a soldier's home, to an elaborate tomb. And of course, this goes back to the account that we looked at last week, where we considered Napoleon's very wonderful retirement. Well, there is a very interesting historical account about how France, after the rule of Napoleon, had to play a very complex diplomatic game in order to have Napoleon's ashes returned to the wonders of France. Napoleon said that he loved the French people. And indeed, they loved him too, and didn't concern themselves with the fact that nearly 1 million of them were killed during the Napoleonic Wars. He was just trying to do what was best for France, and he did his best. He was respected, he was given a good retirement, even by his adversaries, and naturally he had to be returned to France so his ashes, or actually his remains, could be interred. The account of how they actually exhumed him in St. Helena is quite intriguing in and of itself, and the way they looked at the remnants of Napoleon and what a wonderful preserved condition he was in. Well, this is his tomb today in Les Invalides, or the Old Soldier's Home, and it's a very impressive structure. Indeed, you can see that this is quite frankly a tomb that matches, or dare I say exceeds, the tombs that we just saw of the US presidents. All for Napoleon. Napoleon, the individual who started terrifying wars in the 1800s and was directly responsible for the death of over 6 million individuals. That number seems to come up a lot, I'm not sure why, but maybe it's just another coincidence. In the older images, you can see that this has always been a very impressive structure, and of course, because of its early construction date, we naturally do not have construction photos. And I really couldn't find any construction paintings or sketches, although there's, as usual, no shortage of sketches with the plans. You can see that it's an elaborate complex, and that, indeed, even the very ground and the roads and the walkways seem to have an elaborate set of stones behind them. And I'm always questioning what materials these are made out of, especially since we have questionable elements to what materials actually go into the construction of these wonderful structures. Just trying to put myself in what we're told of 1706 with individuals wearing leggings, and then you look at the works of Victor Hugo where people were in a dire state of poverty, yet somehow they managed to pull off these stunning architectural achievements. But as always, we always say the history of Europe is much deeper and has many more years behind it than the history of the United States, so such wonderful structures with their intricacies and wondrous detail is simply explained through the passage of time. Well, officially, the structure took 35 years to build, and you can see the usual array of arches, pediments, windows, decorations, and a very complex and elaborate dome. And granted, this is somewhat after the construction of St. Paul's in London, of course, to replace the earlier St. Paul's Cathedral, and we can compare and contrast the domes. We also look at some of the elaborate structures and statues on the inside with Napoleon's tomb. And just by looking, you get the impression that this is all genuine material, the finest decorations that go up in the cupola. But this is not a state capital officially. We're told that this was originally a soldier's home, the French version of it, and that it was converted into a tomb. Although you could say this is one of these structures that definitely falls under all three of the designations that we have in this exploration. You could say it's a palace, it's a temple, and it's a tomb. And traditionally we associate government buildings with palaces, we associate religious buildings with temples, and tombs are where we put the remains of individuals that are very important, or at least that we are informed by history, in terms of the historical evaluation, were very important. Again, imagine if this sort of a treatment was allocated to the individual with the mustache from the 1930s and the 1940s in Germany. I wonder what the response would be. And here, as you can see in some of the sketches, we have interiors of this very complicated and elaborate dome. And once again, we can question the orientation of the plans and the lack of all perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything. It's just interesting, like many other things are. Again, with the impressive statues always keeping watch over Napoleon's tomb. And you have to ask yourself that question. If you're going to get a good retirement, and if you're going to have an elaborate tomb, what exactly do you have to achieve? Do you really have to rule a nation as an emperor or a dictator, or however you want to designate Napoleon? It depends on what historical accounts you consult. And you'll find yourself placed in this very elaborate tomb, this entire palace complex, which is really what this soldier's home actually is. And indeed, we think of the elaborate construction that we have for many of the so-called soldiers' homes that still exist to this day in the United States. And you may recall we did an exploration of the very impressive one in Milwaukee. I'm sure that to this day, Napoleon can rest easy, knowing that he had a comfortable retirement. Looks like that statue has the hand a little lower, but it's a hidden hand. I don't know where he's actually sticking it, do you? And now let's look at the Taj Mahal, constructed 1631 to 1653 in India. Officially, this is a fine example of Islamic and Hindu architecture, or depending on how you actually want to designate it. But we're not going to concern ourselves with the historical account. We're simply going to appreciate the wonders of this structure. This is a very well-known and appreciated structure across the land. Indeed, anywhere you go, people will talk about visiting the Taj Mahal. We're informed that its construction material is fine marble, and that it has many wondrous intricacies to it. Indeed, a uniquely shaped dome, minarets and towers, and of course the fine stone patterns that lay out the walkways, or the promenade, or whatever you want to call it. And you can see that there is wondrous and beautiful detail behind this particular structure. It's easy to understand why people would come across the lands to visit this in vast droves. And indeed, this structure is just as intricate on the inside, where we can see the fine detailing of interior architectural stylings. Now, we're informed that the historical account indicates that an individual who was a ruler decided to construct this for their significant other, although many people aren't even aware that the Taj Mahal is actually part of a complex in and of itself. That tends to be the case with a lot of tombs, is that they're actually part of a complex. Although one could understand why people wouldn't be aware of that, because typically the main structure of the Taj Mahal is what's featured, not the other structures that are on the same grounds. And so it leads to other questions about what was really happening. It could be that the main elements of this historical account are true, but when you look at the fine artistry and inscriptions that go across the walls and the exterior walls of the Taj Mahal, you cannot help but be awed and in wonderment in terms of everything that's displayed within the structure. And indeed, you can understand why it is a very profound and, dare I say, spiritual experience to visit a structure like this in person, regardless of what your personal beliefs may be. And even if you totally accept the historical account of its origin, which is completely fine, or you believe there may be an alternative account in terms of the construction of this very impressive structure, I think we can all agree that this is something that we definitely would not be able to replicate today. Well, let's take a look at some palaces, and as we stated earlier, the palaces reflect the government buildings, as we call them, the many wondrous state capitals of the United States, such as Austin, Texas. We're going to be doing an on-site exploration in Austin, Texas coming up soon. And no, the capital of Texas is not Houston, contrary to what Powers Booth said in the film Red Dawn. Looking on the inside of the dome, you can see a very impressive palette of colors, and yet it gives the impression of gold. There's also the Rhode Island Capitol, such a very impressive capital for a geographically small state, although we don't want to diminish the importance of Rhode Island. We also want to remember the fact that Rhode Island is not actually an island, but it's a pretty interesting name, and it's got a very beautiful Capitol building. Definitely a state to explore. And if you go to the state capitol in Pennsylvania, you'll see the same architectural stylings. And most of these wondrous U.S. state capitals were constructed in the 1800s. We do have some accounts of impressive ones that were constructed in the early 1900s. And then we even have the old state capital of Louisiana, which looks exactly like a castle. And don't worry, for those of you who are fans of the current state capital of Louisiana, we will be exploring that soon as well. That's quite an interesting story in and of itself. But whether you're looking at the federal capital, or you're looking at the state capital in Texas, or you're looking at St. Paul's Cathedral, which in London, oddly enough, bears a resemblance to a U.S. state capital, or the U.S. state capitals bear a resemblance to the cathedral in St. Paul in London that we're seeing right now. Nice little eagle. Or is it a phoenix? Or is it some other kind of bird? Well, it's not a double-headed bird, so. I've always been fascinated, though, by the account of the Iowa State Capitol, and indeed, you know, it is building number one for all explorations on this channel. I know that you're all well aware of how much I appreciate the Iowa State Capitol, and imagine my surprise when I went inside and they told us that scagliola is this imitation marble or granite that's in all the columns. And of course, they give us these examples that we can't handle. These two examples that have the exact same name despite being imitation marble and granite. Maybe there's some other names we could come up with. Perhaps fakeola? It's fakeola material, or maybe we could call the marble fakeola, and the granite dufaciola. Dufaciola is your imitation granite, or call both of them obeiola. See, some alternate names that seem a little more catchy. I don't know, I'm getting the impression that someone's trying to sell us wooden nickels yet again. And you think about that whole concept. People from the rural areas going into the cities and then told to beware of imitations, and then being told that all their structures are imitations, such as the structures at the World's Fair. And now the columns in the Iowa State Capitol are imitations. Now, do you really believe that? Well, look at the actual columns and examine the strength, and you can still touch the columns in the Iowa State Capitol. At least there's no sign that says that you can't. And you can actually compare and contrast it visually with what you have with what's displayed on one of these fine radiators. And of course, these don't seem to be actual material, and of course they do admit that they're handmade. So I wonder, compare and contrast what they're displaying here to the column in the background. And do you really think that this column is actually some sort of fake material? Are all these columns that hold up the elaborate dome of the Iowa State Capitol from the official historical account since 1886 or earlier, or whenever the columns were put in there, were actually made of some sort of fake imitation material? Find it a little hard to believe. But of course, the other material, the Iowa State Capitol, they're not going to say is some sort of fake or imitation material. And if you go and you assess these columns, you'll find that they tend to be real. Looking at the account of the Great Fire at the Iowa State Capitol, which it managed to survive, we can see the original news clipping from the Register. And this picture, which oddly enough still has the same issues that we have with all the pictures of the Iowa State Capitol fire in the early 1900s. And of course, conflicting accounts of damages, and that's the original paper, but that's the best picture that you tend to get. And of course, we have the candles, and these displays really communicate to us that this is exactly what happened. There was this terrible fire, and the heroic efforts of one individual prevented this fire from destroying the Iowa State Capitol. And then, of course, the individual who saved the state capitol then fell to their death later. I also saw this interesting picture I hadn't seen in the Iowa State Capitol. It shows the 168th Infantry Regiment posing for a picture, a painting, a combined picture or painting that shows the Capitol grounds in 1919. And we can see the Soldiers and Sailors column, or the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And oddly enough, when you look at this image, it's hard to tell or determine the difference between real and fake. And there we have that smoke column that appears in the picture, and oddly enough, some sort of triumphal arch. Now, neither the triumphal arch or the smoke column exist on the Capitol grounds to this day. So what is this really telling us? Well, you can also look in the interior of the dome of the Iowa State Capitol and compare and contrast it with the interior of the dome in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and you'll find many similarities in terms of layout and how they look and all the renovations that they're constantly doing on both structures. It's as though someone really is trying to give us a different impression. And of course, looking at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, the one that they built in the 1890s but didn't bother to dedicate to the Iowa Civil War veterans until 1945, when there were only 6 of them left. There's other structures in Des Moines I haven't looked at, such as this Scottish Rite Temple. Ah, yes, a Scottish Rite Temple. Very impressive structure, and it looks like we have continuous columns, and well, isn't that an interesting little eagle there with the number 32, and it looks like the symbol of the Triforce there in the middle of it. I don't know why, I just have Legend of Zelda vibes. That's just me. There's also this little minor basilica that's not too far from Drake University, which we explored before, and this is yet another structure that falls in that 1890 to 1920 wondrous construction period. Of course, the accounts of its construction tend to vary, and we see that they decided to cut all the stones in a unique shape and fit them together as though they were playing a very intricate game of Tetris, because, well, why not make things more difficult when you're constructing it? Now, I don't know what actually happened, I wasn't there to witness it, but I can certainly look and appreciate the structure for all that it is. Indeed, this very tall and impressive tower that has other elements to it that, for some reason, reminds me of the towers that we saw in Bologna, albeit a much shorter one. And much as is the case with other structures, they're constantly renovating this minor basilica, or whatever we want to call this particular structure. It's just interesting to me looking at some of the symbolism behind it, if this was actually a Catholic structure. And let's not forget that it has an obelisk on the grounds too, and then it's connected in yet another complex. So what are your thoughts on these temples, tombs, and palaces? What do you think's the real story behind them? I think every time we do these explorations, we uncover a little more, but please share your thoughts with me. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.